Long before history was written, before cities rose from river valleys and before humans learned to shape metal, people told the same terrifying story. It appeared in lands separated by oceans and mountains, among tribes who never met, and civilizations that never traded words. The details changed, but the core never did. Somewhere beyond the safety of firelight, there existed beings that looked like humans but were larger, stronger, and hunted people as prey. In ancient Mesopotamia, early tablets spoke of beings born before mankind who towered over ordinary humans. In the Hebrew traditions, they were remembered as the Nephilim, described as mighty men of old, beings of immense size and power. In Greece, travelers whispered of cyclopes and titans, creatures not merely monstrous in form, but disturbingly human in behavior. They lived in caves, watched settlements from the dark, and seized travelers who wandered too far from the group. Across northern Europe, Norse sagas told of the Jotnar, giants who roamed wilderness regions where humans rarely survived. These giants were not mindless beasts. They were hunters. They tracked villages, attacked isolated farms, and sometimes carried people away alive. In Native American traditions, particularly among Algonquian-speaking tribes, stories warned of the Wendigo, a towering humanoid predator that stalked humans during winter scarcity. These stories were not told as entertainment. They were warnings, often passed from parent to child with strict seriousness. Far from the Arctic forests, Polynesian islanders described ogre-like beings living in remote valleys and caves, creatures that preferred human flesh and hunted at night. In South Asia, Rakshasa legends spoke of shape-shifting giants that lurked near human settlements and abducted people under cover of darkness. Despite massive cultural differences, geography, and time separation, these accounts repeated specific behavioral patterns. The beings were large but human-shaped. They were intelligent hunters. They preferred human victims. And they operated near the edges of human territory rather than deep wilderness. For centuries, historians dismissed these accounts as mythology. The reasoning was simple. Ancient humans feared the unknown, and imagination filled the gaps in knowledge. Lightning became gods, storms became spirits, dangerous animals became monsters. The man-eating giant was assumed to be nothing more than a symbolic representation of fear itself. But one problem persisted. Predators in myths usually resemble real animals exaggerated. Dragons resemble reptiles. Sea serpents resemble whales or giant squid. Yet the man-eating giant did not resemble any known animal. It resembled a human, not just vaguely, but specifically. The proportions, behaviors, and even intelligence were consistently human-like. More unusual still, these legends were not heroic tales of victory. In many traditions, humans lost, entire villages vanished, children were taken, and never returned. Travelers disappeared along known routes. The tone of the stories resembled survival instruction more than entertainment. Many included advice. Stay in groups, avoid caves, do not travel at night, and never wander during harsh winters. Anthropologists noticed another strange feature. These stories often appeared in cultures that also preserved accurate knowledge about real extinct animals long after those animals disappeared. Indigenous Australians preserved descriptions of giant marsupials that matched fossil evidence discovered thousands of years later. Native American oral traditions described mammoths in ways consistent with paleontology. This raised a question that was uncomfortable but unavoidable. If humans could remember extinct animals for thousands of years, could they also remember encounters with other types of humans that no longer exist? The 19th century brought the first cracks in the old assumptions. Fossil discoveries in Europe revealed that modern humans were not the only form of human that had lived on Earth. Large bones emerged from caves in Germany and France. These bones did not belong to apes or animals. They belonged to people, but not quite like modern people. Their skulls were thicker, their brow ridges heavier, their bodies more powerfully built. At first, scientists believed they had found diseased individuals or deformed humans. The idea that another kind of human once existed seemed too extreme, but more skeletons appeared across continents. The pattern was undeniable. Humanity had relatives, and some of them were larger and physically stronger than modern humans. As research progressed, the timeline became clearer. For most of human existence, Homo sapiens did not live alone. The world was shared with multiple human species. Some adapted to cold climates, others to forests, and some to mountainous terrain. Many of these relatives possessed bodies built for strength rather than endurance. Their bones showed muscle attachment sites far larger than those of modern humans. A single individual could overpower a modern person in direct confrontation. Yet fossils alone did not connect them to the ancient stories. Being large did not mean being hunters of humans. The key evidence would need to come from behavior, and behavior leaves marks not in myths, but in bones. During early excavations, researchers focused mainly on identifying species differences, but gradually attention shifted to the surfaces of the bones themselves. Under magnification, some human remains showed patterns identical to butchered animals, clean slicing marks where muscles had been removed, controlled fractures designed to extract marrow, skull openings placed exactly where access to the brain would be easiest. These were not accidents. They were not animal bites. They were systematic processing marks made by stone tools wielded by human hands. The unsettling realization began to form. Ancient humans were not only hunters of animals, in some places they hunted each other. However, this raised another problem. Cannibalism could occur in desperate starvation. Shipwreck survivors and isolated communities had historically resorted to it under extreme conditions. But starvation cannibalism leaves chaotic evidence. Broken bones occur randomly and processing is crude. The archaeological sites instead showed organized butchery, the same method used on prey animals. The individuals had not simply died and been eaten. They appeared to have been killed, processed, and consumed as food. The ancient legends had always described something specific, not ritual, not desperation, but predation. Larger beings hunting smaller humans as a food source. At the time, the connection remained controversial. Scientists avoided linking folklore with evidence, fearing speculation, but the parallel could not be ignored. Across continents, ancient humans remembered a time when something human-shaped hunted them. Across archaeological sites, bones showed that humans had indeed been treated as prey. If the memories were real, they would date back not thousands, but tens of thousands of years, preserved through oral tradition across generations beyond counting. The first chapter of this investigation, therefore, begins not with monsters, but with memory. The possibility that what later became myth was once ordinary reality, repeated so often that survival required children to learn it before they learned anything else. The fire was not only for warmth. The group was not only for cooperation. Night was not feared because of darkness alone. Somewhere in humanity's distant past, humans had competitors that looked like them, thought like them, and ate them. As scholars compared traditions more closely, they noticed that the stories did not merely describe size, they described patterns of behavior with remarkable consistency. The beings rarely attacked large gatherings in daylight. They waited for darkness, storms, or winter scarcity. They preferred isolated individuals, especially children or injured adults, and they returned repeatedly to the same areas once they learned where humans lived. This detail was important because mythology normally exaggerates the dramatic. Dragons breathe fire openly across cities. Sea monsters overturn entire fleets. But the man-eating giant did something different. It behaved cautiously. It avoided risk. It hunted efficiently. That is not the behavior of a supernatural creature invented for storytelling. That is predator behavior. In several Native American traditions, warnings specifically instructed children not to wander far from the village because something that walked upright could track them silently. Elders emphasized that the danger understood human habits. It watched trails. It learned routines. This intelligence separated it from bears or wolves, which were also feared but described differently. Bears attacked camps. Wolves stalked herds. The other being studied people. Similar instructions appear in Scandinavian folklore. Some sagas warned travelers to avoid sleeping in certain caves or mountain passes because giants listened for voices carried by the wind. The stories emphasized that these beings preferred surprise and silence. They approached against the direction of sound, so victims would not hear them. Such tactical awareness again matched human hunters more than animals. In South Asian epics, Rakshasa figures were said to disguise themselves or mimic human sounds to lure victims away from safety. While later retellings made these abilities magical, the earliest descriptions suggest deception rather than sorcery. Hunters today use similar strategies, imitating prey calls to draw animals within reach. If a creature understood language patterns or emotional responses, it could potentially manipulate them. Anthropologists studying oral traditions realized another important feature. Many of these warnings were embedded in child-rearing practices. They were not optional entertainment. They were behavioral instructions enforced through fear. Societies often encode real dangers into memorable narratives, so the next generation obeys without needing complex explanation. Poisonous plants become evil spirits. Dangerous rivers become jealous gods. But in this case, the danger consistently retained a human appearance. Some researchers propose that these stories reflected conflict between neighboring tribes. Humans have always fought other humans, and memory could transform enemies into giants over time. However, this explanation struggled to address key elements. Enemy tribes do not consistently appear across isolated continents with the same physical description. More importantly, warfare stories celebrate victory. The giant predator stories emphasized avoidance and helplessness. People did not drive the giants away. They survived by hiding. The turning point in interpretation came when ethnographers documented stories from extremely isolated groups with minimal outside cultural influence. These groups preserved versions of the same warning without contact with European or Asian myths. The descriptions still involved tall human-like hunters that preferred flesh over other foods and avoided firelight. Independent origin became difficult to dismiss. At the same time, archaeology advanced enough to reveal something unsettling about the Ice Age world. Modern humans did not immediately dominate their environment. For most of their existence, they were small, lightly built, and relatively slow compared to other predators. Their primary advantage was endurance running and social cooperation. In close combat, they were vulnerable. A larger hominin species with equal intelligence would hold a decisive advantage. Fossil evidence began to show that such species existed in multiple regions simultaneously. Some possessed wider shoulders and thicker bones, capable of delivering far greater striking force. Others had massive jaws capable of processing tough meat and bone. They were not primitive animals, but skilled tool users capable of organized hunting. If two intelligent predators share territory and compete for the same food, conflict becomes inevitable. And in times of scarcity, predators may hunt each other. Among modern animals, large carnivores often kill rival predators, not only to remove competition, but sometimes to consume them. Lions kill hyenas. Wolves kill smaller canids. The behavior is ecological, not malicious. Applying this principle to ancient humans introduced a disturbing scenario. Early Homo sapiens bands, smaller and physically weaker, moving across unfamiliar landscapes, would represent both competitors and food sources to larger hominins adapted to hunting large mammals. A human group separated from others could resemble vulnerable prey. This possibility reframed the folklore entirely. The giants did not need to be monsters or magical beings. They could be another human species occupying the top predator role in certain regions. Their hunting methods would mirror human strategies because they were human. They would understand camps, fires, trails, and fear because they experienced the same world. Memory of such encounters would imprint deeply on survivors. Unlike animal predators, a human-like hunter breaks psychological expectations. It thinks, plans, and adapts. The fear becomes not just physical, but existential. The boundary between hunter and hunted dissolves. Further support came from linguistic patterns. Some languages preserved ancient words describing man-shaped predators separate from ordinary enemies. The words were older than recorded history and did not translate simply to rival tribe. They implied something different, something both familiar and alien. Over generations, as the beings disappeared, language shifted toward supernatural explanation because no living reference remained. As agriculture and permanent settlements spread, human populations grew larger and safer. Large predators retreated or went extinct. Without direct encounters, the original practical meaning of the warnings faded. What remained became myth, then legend, then entertainment, the details exaggerated. Height increased. Abilities became magical. Yet the behavioral core stayed intact because it had once been survival knowledge. By the time written history began, the last memories had already aged beyond recognition. Writers recorded stories inherited from ancestors who themselves no longer knew the original context. A creature that once represented a dangerous competitor became a symbol of chaos, evil, or punishment. Cultural values reshaped the narrative, but echoes of the old fear remained embedded. Modern readers often approach these stories expecting metaphor, but when examined collectively and compared with prehistoric ecology, they may represent inherited memory from a period when humanity was not alone in its intelligence. The stories could be fragments of real encounters retold across thousands of years until only the outline survived. Thus, the legends that seemed impossible might be distorted reports of a time when humans met other humans whose survival depended on hunting them. Not supernatural beings, not moral allegories, but predators sharing our shape. The investigation therefore moves forward from story to environment. To understand why such encounters could happen, it becomes necessary to examine the world before civilization, when the balance of power between humans and nature was very different from today. To understand how a human could become prey to another human, it is necessary to abandon the modern perspective. Today, humans dominate nearly every environment on Earth. Cities shine through the night. Weapons extend reach far beyond muscle. Animals avoid human scent. The idea that a person could be hunted regularly by something walking upright seems implausible because we live in a world shaped by technology and population density. For most of human existence, none of this was true. For over 95% of our species' history, humans lived in small mobile groups, rarely exceeding a few dozen individuals. They carried no metal, no permanent shelter, and no long-range weapons beyond thrown stone or wooden spear. Fire provided some safety, but only within a narrow circle of light. Beyond that circle stretched darkness, filled with sounds whose sources could not be identified. The Ice Age world was not empty land waiting for humans to conquer it. It was a predator-dominated ecosystem. Saber-toothed cats, giant hyenas, massive bears, and large packs of wolves competed for the same prey animals humans needed to survive. Even herbivores could be deadly. A mammoth or giant bison could kill a hunter instantly. Injury meant death because infection followed quickly without treatment. Human survival depended entirely on cooperation and awareness. A lone individual rarely lived long. Night travel was avoided whenever possible. Camps were chosen with visibility in mind. People slept in shifts because something was always watching. Archaeological evidence confirms this vulnerability. Numerous prehistoric human remains show bite marks from large carnivores. Some skeletons were found deep inside predator dens, indicating humans themselves had been carried off and consumed. Early humans were hunters, but they were also hunted regularly. The difference between animal predation and intelligent predation lies in predictability. Animals hunt by instinct. Their patterns can be learned and avoided. Humans learned to recognize wolf territories, lion ambush points, and bear seasonal behavior. Knowledge became protection. But what if another predator possessed the same intelligence and learning ability? Around 300,000 years ago, multiple human species occupied overlapping regions across Africa and Eurasia. They were not identical variations, but distinct populations adapted to different climates and prey. Some specialized in endurance, tracking across open plains. Others thrived in cold, mountainous terrain. Physical differences were significant enough that direct confrontation favored certain groups. The remains of these ancient relatives reveal bodies built for power rather than distance travel. Their limbs were shorter but thicker. Muscle attachment ridges on their bones indicate tremendous upper body strength. The grip force, estimated from finger bones, far exceeds that of modern humans. They were capable of controlling struggling large animals at close range. Modern humans rely heavily on projectile hunting and endurance pursuit. We chase prey until exhaustion weakens it. Larger hominins appear to have relied more on ambush and close combat, delivering powerful strikes at short distance. In open conflict, the lighter frame of Homo sapiens would struggle against such strength. Environmental pressure intensified competition. Ice Age climates fluctuated unpredictably. Herd migrations shifted. Winters grew longer. Food scarcity forced predators to broaden diet whenever opportunity appeared. Opportunistic feeding is common among carnivores. If a prey species becomes abundant and vulnerable, predators incorporate it into their hunting strategy. Human groups moving through unfamiliar territory could unknowingly enter areas already claimed by larger hominin populations. Unlike animals, these inhabitants would recognize another human as both competitor and potential food. They would understand migration routes, camp patterns, and defensive behavior because they shared similar cognitive abilities. Evidence from early campsites suggests defensive measures beyond protection from animals. Some sites show repeated occupation of elevated ground, offering wide visibility. Others reveal deliberate placement of sleeping areas near cliff edges or water barriers, limiting approach directions. While such strategies protect against many predators, they are particularly effective against stealthy bipedal attackers approaching on foot. In several regions, archaeologists discovered clusters of human remains, showing trauma consistent with violent encounters. Blunt force injuries to the skull, defensive fractures in forearms, and projectile wounds appear in patterns indicating organized attack rather than random accident. Some bodies were left intact, suggesting conflict. Others were processed after death in ways resembling food preparation. The distinction between violence and consumption becomes critical. Warfare produces casualties, but rarely systematic nutritional processing. When bones display consistent breakage from marrow extraction and muscle removal identical to animal carcasses, the implication shifts from conflict to predation. This possibility reframes the relationship between human species. They were not merely neighbors or rivals. Under certain conditions, one could occupy the ecological role of hunter while another became prey. Survival psychology would adapt accordingly. Groups would avoid certain valleys not because animals lived there, but because encounters with human-like predators occurred. Oral warnings would emphasize caution around caves where ambushes could wait. Night movement would be restricted, not solely due to visibility, but due to risk of silent approach by something that understood human behavior. Over generations, memory of specific groups would generalize into a category. Children would not be taught species names, but behavioral patterns. The enemy becomes a type rather than an individual tribe. Eventually, as populations shifted and species disappeared, The memory would persist without reference point, becoming legend. Before reaching that point, however, humans lived in direct proximity to these relatives for thousands of years. They shared rivers, prey herds, and sheltering terrain. Encounters were inevitable. To appreciate how such interactions might unfold, it is necessary to examine the physical capabilities of the larger hominins themselves and understand just how different they were from modern humans despite sharing a common ancestry. The physical differences between early Homo sapiens and their larger relatives were not cosmetic. They shaped survival itself. Modern humans evolved for endurance movement across long distances. Our legs are long relative to our bodies, our joints optimized for repetitive motion, and our cooling system allows sustained activity in heat. We exhaust prey rather than overpower it. Other hominins followed a different evolutionary path. Their bones were thick and dense, particularly in the arms and shoulders. Muscle attachment areas on fossil skeletons reveal enormous strength. The chest cavity was wider, supporting powerful lung capacity for bursts of exertion rather than prolonged running. Their center of gravity favored stability during grappling or striking. In practical terms, they were built for close quarters hunting. A modern comparison helps clarify the difference. Endurance predators such as wolves rely on coordinated pursuit, wearing down prey until collapse. Ambush predators, such as big cats, depend on explosive strength at short range. Early Homo sapiens resembled the first strategy. Some of their relatives resembled the second. Both approaches can be effective, but when the two types meet directly, the ambush specialist holds advantage at close distance. Stone tools found alongside these larger hominins show signs of heavy impact use. Certain spear points were thicker and designed to withstand forceful thrusting rather than throwing. Microscopic wear patterns indicate repeated penetration of tough hide and bone. This suggests hunters who approached prey within arm's reach rather than striking from afar. A creature comfortable entering grappling range with large animals would not hesitate to engage a smaller human. The brain capacity of these relatives equaled or even exceeded that of modern humans. Intelligence was not lacking. Planning, ability, memory, and cooperation existed. Hunting in groups would be expected, just as it was among Homo sapiens. A coordinated group of physically stronger hominins could control territory effectively, especially in constrained landscapes such as valleys or forested hills, where long-distance escape was impossible. Competition over shelter intensified risk. Caves provided protection from weather and predators. Evidence shows repeated occupation layers by different hominin species at the same cave sites separated by time. This indicates cycles of displacement. One group would inhabit a shelter, later replaced by another. Replacement does not necessarily mean peaceful abandonment. In ecological terms, dominant predators often seize prime locations. Some caves reveal abrupt transitions in tool style alongside scattered human bones bearing trauma marks. The pattern implies sudden takeover rather than gradual migration. The inhabitants did not simply leave, they were forced out, injured, or killed. When bones from the previous occupants also show butchery marks, the interpretation moves further from warfare toward consumption. Winter intensified these pressures. During harsh seasons, large herbivores migrated or died off. Hunters faced starvation. In such conditions, predators expand acceptable prey categories. Modern carnivores demonstrate this behavior clearly. Wolves and bears occasionally prey upon each other during scarcity. The nutritional value of a competitor can outweigh the risk if conditions are severe enough. Human bodies, rich in fat around organs and high-energy brain tissue, represent concentrated calories. From an ecological standpoint, they are efficient prey when encountered alone or in small numbers. A hominin group adapted to close combat hunting would recognize this advantage, particularly if smaller humans lacked defensive numbers. The psychological impact on early Homo sapiens would be profound. Animal predators follow instinctive patterns and can be deterred by fire, noise, or coordinated defense. A human-like predator could adapt quickly. It would learn to avoid obvious traps, approach from downwind, and wait for moments of vulnerability such as sickness, injury, or separation from the group. Archaeological campsites sometimes show perimeter arrangements of stone flakes and sharpened stakes beyond what is necessary for animal deterrence. The layout suggests anticipation of attackers capable of understanding and bypassing simple barriers. Defensive organization becomes more complex when the threat shares cognitive abilities. Over generations, selection would favor vigilance and social bonding. Children would be taught strict rules about staying within sight. Group sleeping arrangements would tighten. Night watch roles would emerge. Fear responses would develop not only to animal shapes, but to human silhouettes appearing unexpectedly. Even today, humans react strongly to seeing human-like figures in darkness, a reaction deeper than simple caution. Eventually, the balance shifted. Homo sapiens populations increased, developed improved projectiles, and expanded across wider territories. Larger hominins declined and disappeared, whether through competition, assimilation, or environmental change. With their disappearance, direct encounters ended. But memory remained embedded in behavior and narrative. The unknown predator that walked upright transformed into the giant of stories. Height exaggerated with each retelling, strength magnified into supernatural ability, intelligence reinterpreted as cunning evil. The original ecological relationship faded, yet the emotional imprint endured. To evaluate whether these ancient interactions included deliberate hunting for food rather than occasional violence, the investigation must now focus on the most concrete evidence available. Bones themselves preserve the record of how death occurred and what followed after. Within their surfaces lies the difference between battle, ritual, and predation. When the first unusual human bones were uncovered in European caves during the 19th century, scientists struggled to classify them. They clearly belonged to humans, yet their shape differed dramatically from modern anatomy. The skulls were long and low. Brow ridges formed thick arches above the eyes. The limb bones were heavy and curved slightly from immense muscle load. Early researchers assumed disease or deformity. But as more specimens emerged across different countries, a pattern formed that could not be explained by illness. These remains represented a separate population of humans, later known as Neanderthals. Neanderthals were not towering monsters in the exaggerated sense of folklore, yet compared to the average early Homo sapiens they were imposing, their bodies were wider, thicker, and far stronger. Estimates based on bone density and joint structure indicate grip strength far exceeding modern humans. Their forearms and shoulders were built for sustained force, not delicate motion. Even individuals of moderate height possessed mass equal to much taller modern people. Further discoveries expanded the picture. In Asia, fragments of bone revealed the presence of Denisovans, another group of archaic humans. Genetic evidence shows they possessed powerful physiques similar to or exceeding Neanderthals. In Africa and Europe, Homo heidelbergensis appeared as an earlier ancestor, also robust and capable of confronting large animals directly. These populations were not rare anomalies. For tens of thousands of years, they occupied wide territories overlapping with early modern humans. At times, they lived only a few days' journey apart. The significance of this overlap is profound. Early Homo sapiens were not entering empty land when they migrated. They were entering regions already inhabited by other intelligent hunters, adapted to those environments. Contact was inevitable. Skeletal analysis provides clues about their lifestyle. Neanderthal bones show frequent healed fractures, similar to injuries experienced by modern rodeo riders or close-range hunters handling dangerous animals. Broken ribs, arms, and facial bones healed repeatedly during life. Such trauma indicates routine engagement with powerful prey at minimal distance. They did not rely primarily on thrown weapons. They approached and struck. Tool technology supports this interpretation. Neanderthal spears were thick and balanced for thrusting. The points were often too heavy for effective long-range throwing, but ideal for controlled penetration during a forward charge. This implies coordinated group attacks where several individuals confronted prey simultaneously. Any species accustomed to this form of hunting would possess courage and physical confidence in direct encounters. Now consider the perspective of early Homo sapiens encountering such a group. Smaller frames, lighter bones, and reliance on endurance rather than strength would make direct conflict extremely dangerous. Avoidance would become the primary survival strategy. Evidence also shows that these groups occupied caves repeatedly across generations. Caves offered shelter, but they also created territorial boundaries. If a migrating sapiens group entered a valley containing an established Neanderthal population, the conflict would resemble predator intrusion more than human diplomacy. Each group hunted the same animals, gathered the same resources, and required the same shelter. The question remains whether such encounters included consumption of humans as prey. The answer begins to emerge from cut marks on bones discovered in several Neanderthal habitation sites. Human remains found alongside animal bones display identical processing patterns. Flesh removal occurred systematically along muscle lines. Joints were separated efficiently, bones were cracked in controlled ways to access marrow. These marks were made using the same stone tools used to butcher deer or bison. The process required knowledge of anatomy and deliberate effort. It was not the chaotic damage of scavengers or post-burial disturbance. At some sites, multiple individuals were processed in this manner within the same layer, suggesting repeated behavior rather than a singular desperate event. The distribution of age groups includes adults and juveniles alike, consistent with opportunistic hunting rather than selective ritual. Another species complicates the story further. Gigantopithecus, a massive ape from Asia, reached enormous size, far larger than any human. Though not a human species, its coexistence with early humans may have influenced perceptions of large humanoid creatures. However, Gigantopithecus likely disappeared long before widespread human migration across its range. Its relevance lies mainly in demonstrating that large bipedal primates once existed in human memory. The real candidates for the man-shaped predator are the robust hominids sharing both intelligence and environment with Homo sapiens. They did not need to be giants by mythical standards. To a smaller human living without weapons beyond stone and wood, a broader, stronger individual capable of overpowering prey animals would appear formidable enough. Genetic evidence reveals occasional interbreeding between these populations. This indicates that encounters were not exclusively hostile. Some groups interacted peacefully or merged. Yet, coexistence does not eliminate conflict. Modern human societies intermix, yet still fight. In prehistoric conditions with limited resources, peaceful interaction would alternate with violent competition. The presence of healed injuries on both sapiens and Neanderthal skeletons indicates they survived encounters with each other. Not every meeting ended. Examines those traces in detail, revealing whether the relationship between these human species crossed the boundary from conflict into predation. The distinction between killing and eating is not subtle in archaeology. Bones preserve information long after flesh disappears. Under magnification, the edge of a stone blade leaves a recognizable signature, a fine linear groove with parallel microstriations caused by mineral grains in the tool. When that groove appears repeatedly along muscle attachment sites, it indicates deliberate removal of meat. When joints are separated cleanly, it shows knowledge of anatomy. When long bones are fractured at controlled angles, it reveals intentional marrow extraction. Several sites across Europe provide exactly this pattern lightly before breaking, leaving curved fracture edges. Dry bone shatters differently, even clearer pattern. The bodies were disarticulated in the same order used when processing large prey. First, the limbs were removed, then the major muscle groups sliced away, then the torso opened, and finally the skull modified. This sequence matches efficiency rather than ritual. Ritual treatment tends to focus on specific parts. Nutritional processing removes everything usable. Age distribution also matters. In ritual contexts, societies often treat certain categories differently, sometimes favoring adults or particular genders. Here, children, adolescents, and adults all appear with identical treatment. From an ecological perspective, prey is prey regardless of age. The uniformity supports the interpretation of food consumption rather than symbolic behavior. Skeptics once proposed that animals could have produced some of the damage. Carnivores gnaw bones, leaving puncture marks and crushing patterns. However, tooth marks differ clearly from blade marks. At these sites, tooth marks are rare and appear after cutting, meaning animals scavenged leftovers rather than causing the initial damage. The primary processing agent was human. One particularly revealing detail involves skull modification. Several skulls were opened in a standardized way, removing the top portion cleanly. The edges were smoothed through handling, suggesting the pieces may have been used as containers before disposal. While this might appear ritualistic, it also follows a practical function. A skull cup holds liquids or soft tissue, allowing consumption of brain matter without waste. Efficiency and utility often coexist. Another line of evidence comes from chemical analysis. Bone tissue retains traces of diet through stable isotopes. Some Neanderthal remains show nitrogen isotope ratios comparable to top carnivores like wolves and lions. This indicates a diet heavily reliant on meat, sometimes including high trophic level consumption. Occasional consumption of other humans would elevate these ratios further, consistent with findings in certain individuals. The same type of evidence appears in Homo sapiens sites as well. Early modern humans also practiced cannibalism in specific contexts. However, the pattern differs. In many sapien sites, treatment varies and sometimes includes deliberate placement or decoration, suggesting ritual significance. In the sites linked to larger hominids, the process is standardized and indistinguishable from animal butchery. This difference suggests motivation. Ritual cannibalism expresses belief. Nutritional cannibalism expresses survival strategy. Predatory cannibalism expresses ecological opportunity. The presence of multiple processed individuals in a single occupation layer implies repeated behavior rather than isolated starvation. Groups return to the same cave and process new bodies in the same manner. That regularity aligns with an established food source rather than emergency action. Such behavior would influence the memory of smaller human groups encountering it. Discovering the remains of companions treated like hunted animals would create lasting fear. The knowledge that the attacker might not only kill, but also consume victims alters perception fundamentally. It shifts the enemy from rival to predator. In this context, legends describing beings that carried people away and never left remains become understandable. If victims were processed and consumed, little recognizable evidence would remain near the abduction site. Survivors would only see disappearance. Over generations, details simplify. People remember what matters for survival. Stay together, avoid certain places, fear the human-shaped hunter. Height and strength exaggerate through retelling, but the behavioral core persists because it once described real risk. The archaeological record does not claim that all interactions between human species were predatory. Cooperation, trade of mates, and shared territories likely occurred at times. Yet the evidence demonstrates that under certain conditions, some groups treated other humans as prey. This establishes the biological possibility behind the ancient warnings. To understand why this behavior would emerge repeatedly rather than rarely, it becomes necessary to examine the evolutionary incentives involved. Hunting another human is dangerous, yet it also offers specific advantages under environmental pressure. The next stage of investigation considers those pressures and the logic guiding a predator capable of recognizing itself in its prey. To determine whether prehistoric cannibalism represented rare desperation or systematic behavior, archaeologists rely on context. A single skeleton with cut marks can result from starvation, ritual, or even post-burial disturbance. But when entire sites contain repeated patterned treatment of multiple individuals, interpretation becomes clearer. The record across Europe reveals locations where humans were not merely killed, but processed as food with the same regularity as animal prey. One of the most studied examples comes from a cave in northern Spain known for preserving deep layers of early human occupation. In one section of the cave, researchers uncovered remains belonging to a group of young individuals and adults. The bones were mixed with stone tools and the remains of butchered animals. At first glance, this seemed typical for a habitation site, but microscopic examination revealed something unusual. The human bones showed identical cut marks to those on deer and horse bones found beside them. Muscle attachment points on arms and legs had been sliced cleanly to remove flesh. The long bones were cracked in spiral patterns, indicating they were broken while fresh to extract marrow. The skulls were opened at the base, where access to brain tissue is easiest. Importantly, no burial arrangement or symbolic placement appeared. The remains were scattered like kitchen waste. The distribution of marks followed a strict order. First, the major limbs were separated, Then muscles were removed in large strips. Finally, the bones were fractured for nutritional extraction. This is the most efficient way to process a carcass. It requires familiarity and repetition. Accidental or desperate cannibalism produces irregular cuts and missed resources. Here, nothing edible was ignored. Further north in France, another cave site provided independent confirmation. Remains of Neanderthals were discovered, bearing similar treatment. Stone tool grooves appeared along rib edges where the chest had been opened. Finger bones showed slicing marks from removal of tendons, useful for drying or immediate consumption. The lower jaw was detached and scraped clean. The uniformity of technique across individuals indicated a practiced method rather than chaotic feeding. At a site in England, researchers found skulls shaped deliberately after processing. The tops were removed in a controlled circle, leaving smooth edges. Wear patterns suggested handling after modification. While some interpret this as ritual use, the preparation required first removing the brain and surrounding tissue. The initial purpose remained nutritional, whatever symbolic meaning followed later. Chemical analysis strengthens the interpretation. Burn patterns on some bones indicate roasting at temperatures similar to those used for animal meat. The heat was controlled, not destructive, suggesting cooking rather than disposal. Burned bones also show cracking, consistent with exposure while still containing organic material, again implying food preparation rather than random fire contact. To separate murder from predation, researchers examined trauma before death. Some skeletons show impact injuries to the skull, consistent with fatal blows delivered from above or behind. Defensive fractures on forearms indicate attempts to block strikes. The victims were alive during attack. After death, the same bodies were processed for consumption. A key feature of these sites is repetition over time. Layers representing different years contain the same pattern of human processing. This means the behavior was not a single violent event, but a recurring practice. The group occupying the site repeatedly consumed members of its own or neighboring populations as part of subsistence. Modern humans also appear in similar contexts. Early Homo sapiens sites in some regions contain processed remains of other humans alongside animal bones. However, the frequency and uniformity vary. In certain cases, the treatment is minimal, possibly ritual. In others, especially during harsh climates, it mirrors the efficiency seen in larger hominin sites. The Ice Age environment helps explain this pattern. Glacial advances periodically reduced plant and animal availability. Herd migrations shifted unpredictably. Hunters dependent on large prey faced sudden famine. In such conditions, predators adopt opportunistic feeding strategies. The closest available source of calories can become acceptable. Unlike animals, humans travel in small groups and rely on predictable routines. Camps follow water sources, paths repeat seasonally. A group capable of observing these patterns could ambush individuals at moments of vulnerability. Once the behavior proves effective, it may repeat whenever scarcity returns. Evidence also shows selective targeting. Some sites contain more juvenile remains than expected from natural mortality. Children are easier to overpower and require fewer resources to transport. This aligns with predator efficiency rather than warfare, where adult males dominate casualty lists. The cumulative findings across multiple locations create a consistent picture. Humans were not always apex predators beyond threat. In certain regions and times, some human groups occupied a higher position in the food chain relative to others. They killed, butchered, and consumed them using established techniques. Understanding that this occurred is only part of the explanation. The deeper question concerns motivation. Violence alone does not guarantee consumption. The decision to treat another human as prey requires ecological pressure strong enough to override risk and recognition of similarity. The next step examines the evolutionary logic that could make such behavior not only possible, but adaptive under specific circumstances. Once archaeologists accepted that human bodies were processed in the same systematic way as animal carcasses, the debate shifted from whether cannibalism occurred to why it occurred so consistently. The answer required combining ecology, nutrition science, and behavioral anthropology. The bones showed what happened. The environment explains why it could become routine. During the Ice Age, climates changed rapidly within a human lifetime. Temperatures dropped, vegetation retreated, and large grazing animals migrated or died off. Hunters dependent on these animals faced sudden shortages of fat, the most valuable nutrient in cold environments. Without adequate fat intake, humans experience protein poisoning, a lethal condition where the body cannot process excess lean meat. Survival requires high-energy tissue, particularly organs and brain matter. Human bodies contain exactly those resources. The brain alone provides dense calories and essential fatty acids. Bone marrow offers concentrated fat available even in winter when animals grow lean. In ecological terms, a human body represents a compact package of the same nutrients hunters sought in large prey. The difference is accessibility. A small human group lacks horns, hooves, or defensive mass. If captured, it yields food comparable to multiple smaller animals with less risk of injury than confronting a mammoth or bison. Predators calculate risk instinctively. Injury means death over time. Hunting strategies favor targets offering high return with manageable danger. A larger hominin group encountering a smaller one could evaluate that exchange quickly. Cooperation within the attacking group reduces risk further. Once the practice proves effective during famine, memory of its success would guide behavior in future shortages. This reasoning does not imply constant hunting of other humans. Stable periods with abundant animals would make such actions unnecessary. But seasonal or multi-year scarcity would reactivate the strategy. Over generations, it could become a conditional behavior triggered by environmental stress rather than random violence. Archaeological sites support this seasonal interpretation. Some layers containing butchered human remains correspond to colder climate phases identified through sediment analysis and pollen records. In warmer layers from the same caves, human remains appear without processing marks indicating normal habitation or burial. The same location alternated between coexistence and predation, depending on resource pressure. Transport patterns reveal additional detail. Certain bones from individuals were carried significant distances into habitation areas, while others were processed at kill sites. This mirrors animal hunting practice, where valuable portions are transported and less useful parts left behind. It suggests deliberate hunting rather than opportunistic consumption of dead bodies found by chance. Cut marks on vertebrae indicate decapitation immediately after death, a technique easing transport and processing. Limb bones, fractured along predictable angles, demonstrate controlled leverage rather than chaotic smashing. These actions require planning and knowledge transmitted across group members. Young individuals in the attacking group would learn the method by observation, normalizing the behavior during critical seasons. Another factor involves territory defense. Killing rival humans removes competition for prey and resources. Consuming them recovers energy invested in conflict. Many carnivores exhibit similar dual-purpose aggression. Lions kill rival cubs to eliminate future competitors and sometimes eat them afterward. The act is not driven by malice, but by ecological advantage. From the perspective of the hunted group, these encounters would appear terrifyingly deliberate. Attackers would not flee after victory, but remain to process the dead. Survivors returning to the site would witness remains treated as animal carcasses. The psychological impact would reinforce avoidance behavior and storytelling warnings to future generations. Such experiences align with traditional narratives describing beings that carried victims away rather than killing openly near settlements. Removing prey prevents defensive retaliation and allows processing in secure areas such as caves. The absence of bodies would enhance the sense of disappearance rather than battle. Over time, smaller groups might alter migration routes, abandoning productive hunting grounds simply because encounters occurred there repeatedly. These abandoned places could later be remembered as cursed or inhabited by dangerous beings long after the original threat vanished. The archaeological record therefore reveals more than isolated acts of desperation. It shows an adaptive strategy triggered by environmental pressure and facilitated by physical advantage. Some humans became predators of other humans, not continuously, but predictably under certain conditions. To complete the explanation, it remains necessary to examine the evolutionary reasoning behind choosing human prey specifically. Many animals were available, yet under stress humans sometimes targeted each other. Understanding that choice requires looking beyond nutrition to cognition, perception, and the unique problem of recognizing oneself in the prey species. Predation is rarely driven by cruelty, and familiar prey became scarce. Intelligent hunters were forced to reassess what counted as acceptable food. The decision was not emotional. It was mathematical, calculated through instinct, shaped by survival. To understand why one human species might hunt another, it is important to examine how vulnerable early Homo sapiens actually were. Modern humans imagine themselves as adaptable. It is weak. We survive through planning and endurance, not strength. Early Homo sapiens were even more vulnerable than modern populations. Their tools were simple and their numbers small. A group might consist of 20 individuals, including children and elders. If separated during migration, only a few adults remained capable of defense. Without metal weapons or fortifications, direct confrontation with a stronger opponent could end quickly. Larger hominins, however, possessed advantages beyond muscle. Their shorter limbs and broader torsos improved balance in grappling situations. A single powerful strike could disable an opponent lacking protective equipment. Their close-range hunting methods meant they were accustomed to controlling struggling prey at arm's length. Against large animals, they relied on teamwork. Against smaller humans, they might require less coordination. Energy economics further favored human prey under certain conditions. Large herbivores, such as mammoth or bison, yielded enormous calories, but required significant effort, planning, and risk. Failure could mean starvation. Smaller animals were easier to catch, but provided little fat. Humans offered a middle ground. They moved predictably along known routes, gathered near water sources, and often lacked defensive formations while traveling. Cognitive similarity also played a role. A predator benefits from understanding prey behavior. Wolves anticipate herd movement because they evolved alongside hoofed animals. A human-like hunter would anticipate human decision-making. It would know when fear causes hesitation, when exhaustion slows reaction, and when group members separate. Ambush points could be selected with precision. Tracking ability strengthens this advantage. Humans are among the best trackers in the animal kingdom. A hominin sharing this skill could follow footprints, broken branches, or displaced stones silently over long distances. The hunted group might never see the pursuer until the final moment. Seasonal patterns make the scenario clearer. During late winter, animal populations decline and human groups weaken from hunger. Children and elders slow travel. Camps move less frequently. Predictability increases. A larger hominin group, observing from a distance, could identify the weakest members and strike at the most vulnerable time. Modern predator behavior offers parallels. Lions prefer prey at the edge of a herd. Individuals separated or injured, they rarely attack the strongest adult in the center. Efficiency governs selection. In prehistoric landscapes, isolated humans would fit the same category. Another factor involves psychological hesitation. Humans instinctively avoid lethal force against beings that resemble themselves. A smaller sapiens group encountering a larger hominin might hesitate in attack due to recognition. The larger group, accustomed to close-range killing of prey, might not share the same restraint, particularly under starvation pressure. This asymmetry would further tilt survival odds. Archaeological evidence suggests that some encounters ended with individuals taken alive. Disarticulation marks sometimes occur away from kill trauma sites, implying transport before death or processing. From a predator perspective, carrying prey to a secure location reduces danger from interference and allows controlled consumption. From a survivor's perspective, disappearance without visible death reinforces fear of abduction. Over generations, such events would create learned avoidance behaviors. Camps would avoid certain valleys. Night travel would cease entirely. Children would be warned not to stray beyond hearing distance. The warnings would eventually become tradition, even after the original predators vanished. This reasoning does not require constant hostility between species. Most encounters may have been avoidance or even neutral observation, but during scarcity, ecological logic could override social recognition. Hunger reduces hesitation. Survival prioritizes calories over similarity. To fully grasp how this dynamic affected daily life, it is necessary to imagine encounters not as battles, but as hunts. The next section reconstructs how these events might have unfolded from the perspective of both hunter and hunted, based on environmental data and behavioral inference. Imagine a late winter landscape at the edge of a glacial advance. Vegetation is sparse, the ground frozen, and animal tracks fewer each day. A small group of early Homo sapiens moves cautiously along a river corridor, following memory of past migrations. Their food stores are nearly gone. They walk slowly, conserving strength. The children remain close to adults. Every sound matters because survival depends on awareness. Unseen beyond a ridge, another group watches. They are not animals driven by blind instinct. They are intelligent hunters, shaped by the same evolutionary pressures, but adapted to direct confrontation. For days, they observe patterns. They note where the smaller group gathers water, where they rest, and which individuals lag behind. They do not rush. Energy must be conserved until certainty replaces risk. Predators rarely attack without advantage. Waiting reduces danger. At dusk, the smaller group forms a temporary camp near scattered trees. Fire is lit, providing warmth, but also revealing position across the landscape. Fire protects from animals unfamiliar with it, yet offers less defense against a being that understands its limits. Light blinds those inside its circle more than those beyond it. Movement outside remains hidden, while those near the flames see only brightness. The observers choose terrain carefully. Approaching from downwind avoids scent detection. Using elevation reduces noise. When darkness deepens and fatigue slows reaction, they close distance. Such a scenario explains why many ancient warnings emphasize night as the dangerous time, not because visibility alone is reduced, but because intelligent hunters prefer conditions where surprise outweighs resistance. An animal charges toward fire by mistake. A thinking predator waits until attention fades. The initial strike would aim for speed. Removing one individual quickly prevents group coordination. If the victim is smaller or isolated, resistance lasts seconds. Panic spreads. The attackers withdraw immediately after success, rather than continue fighting multiple defenders. Efficiency again governs behavior. One prey animal is enough. The remaining group faces a dilemma. Pursuit risks ambush. Staying risks return attack. In prehistoric conditions, survival often required retreat. The captured individual disappears into darkness. From the hunter's perspective, transport to a secure location follows. Processing prey near a defended cave reduces interference from scavengers and retaliation. Evidence of cut marks, distant from trauma sites, supports this sequence in some archaeological findings. Repeated encounters of this nature would teach the hunted group specific rules. Avoid camping near narrow passes where approach routes are limited. Maintain continuous watch. Keep children within reach. Move frequently. These behaviors appear in ethnographic accounts of traditional societies living near dangerous predators, yet here the predator shares human cognition. Memory transforms experience into story. Survivors recount what they saw in terms their children understand. They describe beings larger than ordinary humans, silent in movement, appearing from darkness, taking victims away. Details simplify, but key warnings remain. Do not wander. Stay near the group. Fire alone is not safety. Over generations, the original physical explanation fades as the encounters cease. When the larger hominids eventually decline and vanish, the behavior no longer has a living reference. Later, listeners interpret the warnings metaphorically or spiritually. The predator becomes an ogre, demon, or cursed spirit. Yet the pattern persists because it once encoded real survival information. This reconstruction is supported by how fear develops in humans today. People instinctively react strongly to unexpected human silhouettes at night, even when no threat exists. The reaction is faster and more intense than response to many animals. Such sensitivity may be a remnant of ancient conditions where another human-shaped figure could represent a predator rather than an ally. Understanding the mechanics of the hunt clarifies why the behavior would continue during harsh periods but disappear during stable climates. It also explains why memories endured across cultures despite separation by vast distances. Similar ecological pressures produce similar behavior, and similar behavior reproduces similar stories. The next stage examines what happened when human populations expanded and encounters shifted from isolated predation to broader conflict between groups competing for the same territories. As human populations slowly increased and climates fluctuated, encounters between different human species became more frequent. What may have begun as occasional opportunistic predation gradually turned into a sustained period of tension across shared territories. Neither side existed in isolation anymore. Migration routes overlapped, seasonal shelters repeated, and awareness of each other became constant. In this phase, fear was no longer limited to rare attacks. It became part of daily decision-making. Early Homo sapiens groups began adjusting behavior in ways that reveal persistent threat from something more intelligent than ordinary predators. Camps were placed where open ground allowed distant visibility. Entry paths were limited so that approach could be detected quickly. Sleeping arrangements clustered tightly together rather than spreading out for comfort. These patterns appear repeatedly in archaeological reconstructions of living areas. Fire management changed as well. Instead of maintaining large, bright fires, some groups used smaller controlled flames at night. A large fire illuminates, but also blinds those beside it. A smaller fire preserves night vision while still offering warmth. Such choices suggest awareness that danger might come from beings capable of observing from darkness rather than fearing the light itself. Stone tools also evolved subtly. Spears became more balanced for throwing at greater distance. Lightweight projectile points appeared alongside heavier thrusting weapons. Increasing attack range would be advantageous against a physically stronger opponent. It allowed defense without entering grappling distance. Trauma patterns on skeletal remains support this transition. Some individuals show healed puncture wounds consistent with thrown projectiles rather than close-range blows. This implies defensive encounters where one group attempted to repel another before contact occurred. The objective shifted from confrontation to deterrence. The psychological impact of living under such conditions cannot be overstated. Animal predators create situational fear. Intelligent predators create constant anticipation. Every noise could represent observation. Every absence of sound could signal approach. Sleep becomes shallow, and vigilance becomes habit. Children growing up in this environment would internalize strict behavioral rules, remain within sight, respond immediately to warning calls, avoid wandering during dusk. Such instructions, passed over generations, later appear in traditional stories framed as moral lessons, but originally grounded in survival. Ethnographic parallels exist among recent societies living near hostile groups. People often describe the enemy in exaggerated physical terms, emphasizing strength and speed beyond ordinary humans. The exaggeration is not purely fictional. Under stress, perception amplifies difference. A stronger opponent becomes a giant in memory, particularly to a child witnessing violence. Evidence of group movement patterns further illustrates fear adaptation. Some regions show repeated short-term occupation rather than permanent settlement, even when resources were adequate. Frequent relocation reduces predictability, making ambush more difficult. Mobility becomes defense. At times, encounters escalated beyond isolated attacks. Multiple individuals from one group appear in another group's territory bearing similar injuries. This suggests retaliatory raids. The distinction between hunting and warfare blurred. A group once targeted as prey might organize defense and strike back when opportunity allowed. However, the physical imbalance remained. Larger hominins retained advantage in direct combat. Therefore, Homo sapiens increasingly relied on coordination, planning, and ranged weapons. Social complexity became survival technology. Communication signals likely developed for silent coordination, similar to hand signs used by hunters today. Night watch roles probably became formalized during this period. Instead of occasional alertness, individuals rotated responsibility for monitoring surroundings. Evidence of half placement near sleeping areas supports shared defense arrangements rather than independent resting spaces. All these adaptations point to sustained interaction with a threat capable of learning and returning. Over generations, this period would define cultural memory. It was not a single catastrophic event, but a prolonged era where humans were sometimes hunters and sometimes hunted by beings nearly identical to themselves. Eventually, these pressures would lead to decisive shifts, either coexistence through separation, assimilation through interbreeding, or elimination through competition. The archaeological record suggests that all three occurred in different regions, but one outcome dominated in the long term. The populations that relied more heavily on cooperation and ranged defense expanded, while the physically stronger close combat specialists declined. The next section explores how this prolonged tension evolved into outright conflict, shaping the final disappearance of the other human groups. As generations passed, encounters no longer remained isolated incidents remembered only by survivors. Entire regions began to show patterns of avoidance and occupation linked to the presence of rival human populations. Valleys rich in game would remain unused for decades, then suddenly show dense habitation after a long absence. The land itself became mapped in memory according to danger rather than resource abundance. Archaeological layers demonstrate alternating occupation by different groups within the same shelters. One layer contains tools typical of a robust hominin population. Above it appears a thin abandonment band of wind-blown sediment, followed by a new layer with lighter projectile weapons associated with Homo sapiens. Later still, the sequence repeats in reverse. These cycles suggest repeated displacement rather than peaceful coexistence. The nature of injuries found on skeletons also begins to change. Earlier trauma often reflects sudden overpowering strikes. In later layers, wounds show signs of distance, engagement. Embedded stone points lodged in bone, healed punctures along the ribs, and fractures consistent with thrown weapons appear more frequently. Defense had evolved from escape to resistance. The psychological dimension transformed alongside the physical one. Once the possibility of fighting back existed, fear turned into organized hostility. Groups began to anticipate encounters and prepare for them. Camps positioned near escape routes now also included defensive barriers made from stone clusters or sharpened stakes placed at likely approach paths. These constructions required effort beyond immediate survival needs, indicating expectation of attack. Night behavior also adapted further. Instead of silent concealment, some groups created deliberate noise barriers by arranging loose stones around the camp perimeter. Anyone stepping on them would produce sound, functioning as an early alarm system. Fire placement shifted outward to illuminate approach zones rather than central gathering areas. The purpose of fire had changed from warmth to surveillance. This moral boundary strengthened group identity. By declaring certain acts forbidden, societies defined what it meant to be human. The memory of predation contributed to the creation of taboo. The beings that once hunted humans were no longer just physical threats, but symbols of what humanity must never return to. Some traditions retain details that hint at historical origin. Stories describe giants who understood speech, used tools, and lived in caves. They were defeated not by strength, but by cleverness or cooperation. Such themes parallel the advantages that allowed Homo sapiens to outlast stronger relatives. Cultural narrative preserved the victory as proof of social virtue. Over time, geographical separation diversified the stories. In forest regions, the beings became forest ogres. In mountains, they became stone giants. In cold climates, they became winter spirits that consumed the unwary. The core remained recognizable, a human-shaped predator overcome by unity and intelligence. Eventually, written records captured fragments of these oral histories. By then, thousands of years had passed since the original encounters. Authors interpreted them through religious and philosophical frameworks, adding supernatural elements to explain ancient fears. What had once been ecological competition became moral allegory. Yet beneath embellishment, the structure persisted. The giants lived at the edge of human space. They threatened travelers and children. They were powerful, but could be defeated through cooperation. These details align closely with the reconstructed relationship between different human species sharing territory. As civilization expanded and memory turned fully into legend, humanity no longer recognized the biological origin of the stories. The last witnesses were gone. Only narrative remained. The final chapter explores how these inherited memories shaped human culture, and why echoes of the ancient fear continue to appear in folklore across the world long after the real beings vanished. By the time humans began building permanent settlements and practicing agriculture, the world had already changed in a way no one alive could fully remember. Only one type of human remained. The valleys once avoided were now fields. The caves once watched were storage shelters. Children could wander farther than their ancestors ever dared. Yet the behavior of caution did not vanish entirely. It transformed. Early farming communities created the first clear division between safe and unsafe space. Inside the settlement existed order, cooperation, and predictable life. Beyond its boundary lay uncertainty. This distinction appears in the oldest recorded myths. The dangerous beings always lived outside walls, beyond cultivated land, or deep within forests and mountains. They represented an older world where humans were not secure. These beings were still described with human features. They spoke, planned, and sometimes imitated ordinary people, but they lacked restraint. They ate humans openly. In cultural terms, they embodied the past humanity had escaped. The difference between civilized and savage was not merely technological, but moral. To live together required rejecting the behaviors associated with those ancient predators. Taboos surrounding cannibalism emerged strongly during this period. Many societies developed strict prohibitions accompanied by severe punishment. These rules were not arbitrary. They reinforced identity. By refusing to consume human flesh, the community separated itself from the remembered enemy. The act became symbolic of abandoning humanity itself. Some rituals appear to preserve fragments of the earlier reality. Protective symbols placed at settlement entrances, stories told at dusk warning children not to wander, and seasonal festivals reenacting the defeat of man-eating beings all suggest collective memory reshaped into tradition. Participants may not have known the original source, but the emotional weight remained. Historical records from early civilizations still mention encounters with large human-like beings on distant frontiers. Whether these represent late surviving isolated populations, misidentified travelers, or purely inherited myth cannot always be determined. What matters is consistency. The idea of a human predator did not disappear when the real threat vanished. It embedded itself in culture. Over centuries, details exaggerated. Height increased beyond realistic scale. Abilities became supernatural. Some giants turned into spirits or demons. Yet, certain features resisted change. They preferred human flesh, avoided large groups, and operated near darkness. These elements align closely with the ecological behaviors reconstructed from prehistoric evidence. Psychology may also preserve traces. Humans possess an unusual fear response to ambiguous human shapes in low visibility. Experiments show people detect human silhouettes faster than animal shapes, even when harmless. This sensitivity likely evolved when recognizing another human quickly could determine survival. The fear of being watched in darkness may not be purely imagination, but inherited vigilance. Language retains hints as well. Many cultures maintain distinct words for ordinary enemies and for beings that look human but behave differently. These terms often carry connotations of consumption, deception, or unnatural appetite. They may represent linguistic fossils from a time when such distinction had real meaning. As knowledge accumulated and science explained natural phenomena once attributed to spirits, the man-eating giant remained resistant to simple dismissal. Unlike thunder gods or sea monsters, the figure resembles humanity too closely. It reflects a possibility rather than an impossibility. We know humans can harm humans. The ancient stories only extend that truth into a different ecological context. The legacy of these beings, therefore, exists on multiple levels. Biologically, they were relatives sharing ancestry. Ecologically, they were competitors. Culturally, they became warnings. Morally, they defined boundaries of acceptable behavior. Memory transformed predator into myth, but myth continued shaping human identity long after its origin faded. The final section concludes this examination by considering what the persistence of these stories reveals about humanity's understanding of itself and its past. When the last of the other human populations disappeared, Homo sapiens became alone in a way no previous generation had experienced. For the first time, every face belonged to the same species. Every voice carried the same cognitive pattern. Every silhouette beyond the firelight was either a fellow human or an animal. The ancient uncertainty ended quietly. Yet the psychological space, once occupied by rival humans, did not vanish. It evolved. Civilization required cooperation among strangers in numbers far larger than prehistoric bands. Trust became essential. Trade networks expanded beyond immediate kin. Moral systems grew complex, regulating behavior within growing communities. To maintain cohesion, societies defined what was human and what was not. The image of the man-eating giant provided a powerful contrast. In myths recorded across continents, giants often represent the violation of social rules. They eat without sharing. They kill without negotiation. They live outside law and refuse cooperation. In this way, they embody traits that early humans had once associated with existential danger. By projecting those traits onto legendary beings, communities reinforced internal discipline. Religious traditions further shaped this memory. Some giants became fallen beings punished for excess appetite. Others symbolized chaos before order. The defeat of giants often marked the beginning of civilization in these narratives. This symbolic structure mirrors the prehistoric shift from vulnerability to dominance, but beneath symbolism remains biological fact. Humans once coexisted with other humans who differed physically and behaviorally. Under environmental pressure, some groups hunted and consumed others. The evidence exists not only in myth, but in bone. Cut marks, fractures, and chemical signatures preserve the record without exaggeration. The transformation from predator and prey to single surviving species shaped human psychology deeply. Fear of isolation, emphasis on group loyalty, and strong taboos against cannibalism may all derive partially from that era. Culture became a protective layer, ensuring that humanity would never recreate the conditions that once made humans prey to humans. Even today, the fascination with giants and cannibals persists in literature and film. Stories continue to explore the boundary between human and monster. This persistence suggests that the concept resonates at a fundamental level. It reflects not pure imagination, but inherited memory of a time when that boundary was blurred. Scientific research does not confirm every detail of ancient legend. It does not support the existence of towering supernatural beings. What it does reveal is more unsettling and more plausible. There were other humans. They were strong. They were intelligent. And under certain conditions, they treated other humans as food. The myths of giant hunters, therefore, may not be inventions created to frighten children. They may be echoes of ecological reality, passed down through countless generations until the original context dissolved. When elders warned of the beings beyond the firelight, they may have been repeating instructions once critical for survival. Humanity's ascent to sole dominance did not erase that past. It only concealed it beneath story. By examining fossils, tools, and trauma, we uncover fragments of a world where being human did not guarantee safety from another human species. In the end, the giants who hunted and ate humans were not creatures from fantasy. They were part of our extended family, shaped by the same evolutionary forces, but following a different path. Their disappearance allowed Homo sapiens to define humanity on its own terms. Yet their shadow remains in our stories, reminding us that the line between hunter and hunted once ran within our own kind. Long after the disappearance of other human populations, something unusual persisted in human behavior. People still organized their living spaces as though observation from the outside remained possible. Even in early towns surrounded by walls, homes were built facing inward toward shared courtyards rather than outward toward open land. Entryways were narrow, visibility controlled, and night watch roles continued despite the absence of known predators capable of coordinated infiltration. These choices cannot be explained only by fear of animals. Large animals avoid dense human settlements. Yet vigilance continued as if memory remained embedded not in conscious thought, but in instinctive expectation. In many early agricultural societies, the first organized profession beyond food production was the watchman. Before markets, before written law codes, communities assigned individuals to observe darkness while others slept. The watchman's purpose was rarely described as protection from beasts. Records instead refer to warning against intruders, figures approaching silently, and shapes moving near the boundary between light and shadow. This behavior echoes the ancient conditions under which survival required detection of something that understood concealment. The human mind adapted to expect a thinking observer. When that observer vanished, the habit of vigilance remained. Another trace appears in architecture. Windows in early settlements were small and positioned high above ground level. Such placement limits visibility from outside while allowing occupants to see approaching figures. In regions where large predators were common, defenses typically focused on gates and barriers. But in many human communities, structures prioritized surveillance over strength. They were designed to notice rather than withstand. Folklore reinforced these habits. Stories warned that danger appears when attention fades, when a lone individual wanders, or when a group ignores the boundary between safety and wilderness. These instructions match practical survival rules from a time when a single moment of distraction could allow an intelligent hunter to act. Over centuries, the image of the human predator transformed repeatedly. In some cultures it became a giant living in hills. In others it became a cannibalistic wanderer driven by hunger. In colder regions it became a winter spirit associated with starvation seasons. Despite variation, the core remained a being that was once human or nearly human, but crossed a line others refused to cross. Interestingly, many traditions emphasize that becoming such a being results from breaking a taboo, particularly eating human flesh. This narrative suggests a cultural memory linking cannibalism with losing one's place among humans. Rather than describing an external species, later societies framed the danger as transformation. The ancient predator became a warning of what humans themselves could become under extreme conditions. This shift in interpretation may reflect fading biological knowledge. As generations passed without direct encounter, people no longer recognized that different human populations once existed. Instead, they explained inherited fear through moral teaching. The monster was no longer another group, but a corrupted individual. The lesson remained effective even as the original reality vanished. Psychological research reveals that humans possess unusually strong reactions to faces and body forms in ambiguous environments. A shadow shaped like a person triggers attention faster than any other pattern. This reaction occurs even in individuals raised far from traditional stories. The response likely originates from evolutionary pressure, where recognizing another human quickly determines survival outcomes. The persistence of these responses suggests that the threat of human-like predators influenced neurological development over long periods. Fear circuits shaped by repeated encounters did not disappear when the encounters ended. They became part of baseline perception. Modern exploration of remote caves occasionally reveals arrangements of stones or charcoal marks deep inside where no recent inhabitants lived. Some of these may be remnants of ancient occupation by populations no longer present. For early humans, caves served as both refuge and risk. Entering a cave meant potential shelter, but also potential confrontation with occupants capable of defense. Stories warning against entering unknown caves at night exist across continents. Even children unfamiliar with wildlife dangers often express hesitation toward dark, enclosed spaces. While partly explained by general fear of darkness, the consistency of cave-related caution may reflect ancestral situations where another human group could inhabit such places. The disappearance of rival human species, therefore, did not erase their influence. It changed its form. Physical presence ended, but behavioral imprint endured. Humanity adapted from living among multiple intelligent hunters to living alone, yet retained habits shaped by that earlier coexistence. Understanding this inheritance reframes many cultural practices. What appears superstitious may originate in practical experience too ancient to remember directly. What seems irrational caution may once have prevented death. As scientific study continues to uncover genetic traces of ancient relatives within modern populations, the idea that humanity's past included interaction with other human species becomes clearer. Those interactions were complex, including cooperation, conflict, and at times predation. The epilogue of this history lies not only in bones beneath the ground, but in behavior carried forward unconsciously into the present.